This Old Town with Allen Oren.
Welcome to the weekend edition of This Old Town. We will take a look at some of our favorite journeys through Long Island history, and this time those journeys will be vigorous. We'll be moving with the athletes who engrossed Long Island, with the sports figures, human and not, who left their marks on our plains and our playing fields. They were the first to bring golf to this country, the fastest around the track for decades. There were even two gents named Ruth and Gehrig. Let's start at the links. And start is the appropriate word, because golf got its first strokes, at least in our country, in the hills of Shinnecock. When we think of Shinnecock Hills, we usually think of putting greens and fairways. But historically, that's just part of the course in this old town. Yes, golf got its start in this country at Shinnecock Hills. Samuel Parrish and Edward Meade, two wealthy East Enders, saw golf in Scotland and invited its top pro, Willie Dunn, to design a course here. On this very spot, legend has it, Dunn dropped a golf ball, Meade hit it, hooking it right and driving it over the railroad tracks. Where it landed, they built the first 18-hole golf course in America with the first clubhouse in America by architect Stamford White. As it grew, the club became the model for other course builders who came to take notes. They noted that women were welcome from the start in 1892, with the first woman star, Beatrix Hoyt, playing at Shinnecock. They noted a course loved by the pros as a throwback to the rough, tough Scottish courses, and played by the pros in the U.S. Open in 1986 and the very first Open in 1895. So successfully did they take notes that two other world-class courses arrived nearby, Maidstone and National. Ironically, it was the Shinnecock Indians who helped build the Shinnecock course. Ironic, because the land was originally theirs. Then, through trade and legislation, they were left with a 600-acre reservation. Like most of Long Island's tribes, their arrowheads were used more for hunting than war. They were peaceful traders, specializing in wood scrubs to clean pots. 10 gave their lives to save a neighbor's ship off Southampton. And their most prominent minister was honored with a state plaque and grave, though hardly tended. They remember their heritage each year with a special powwow. But beneath the historic garb are a people governed by their own trustees, ministered by their own church, and employed in a variety of careers in surrounding towns. They are often private, declining to be part of this report, for example. But their reservation, much of it still pristine, ironically probably saved them from extinction. Of 13 Long Island tribes, they're the only community left. I usually end these pieces with the age of the town I'm in. But this old town, well, it's as old as the first Shinnecock Indian. It's as old as the hills, the Shinnecock Hills. And the Shinnecock course is still a favorite among world pros. But let's not slight that army of amateurs. Long Island was home to some of the earliest and finest sports clubs for everyday athletes. You could fish, you could shoot, and of course, you could shoot the breeze in clubs from Oakdale to Woodmere. Perhaps most famous, though, was the Wyandanch Club, part of Smithtown history. Smithtown is surrounded by natural beauty, the waters of river, harbor, and sound. And that may well have drawn its founder to this old town. The story of that founder, Richard Bull Smith, is perhaps the most famous legend of Long Island. He rode a bull for a full day, it said, and Wyandanch, the Indian chief, gave him all the land he encircled. Or, that may be bull, for some say he got his name from the many legal bulls, additions he signed his name to, while others say it was from his large size, this was his special chair, and blustery disposition. This 10th generation Richard Smith, also a large man, says most of the family disowns the legend. Most.
I have one very devout uncle who still believes in it.
That's all.
I hope so.
The more historical account is no less dramatic. Wyandanch's daughter was kidnapped at her own wedding, and the Indian abductors arranged ransom through Lion Gardner and perhaps Bull Smith. The rest can be read in the words of this land deed. Wyandanch gave the land to Gardner, who later gave it to Smith, a witness to the chief's signature, a two friends mark. Either way, it's ironic that Smith's graveyard is overgrown, though the grave itself is as imposing as the master. Back to Smithtown's natural beauty, it still draws recreational sportsmen. In fact, the Wyandanch Club in this historic building was for decades one of the island's most famous hunt and fish clubs. Yet biking, it turns out, was the town's biggest craze. At the turn of the century, bike paths ribboned the area, and women wore special bloomers to help them pedal. The railroad even ran biking trains from Manhattan and sponsored Mile-a-Minute Murphy, who vowed to keep up with a 60-mile-an-hour train. And did. So here's a town that rode into existence on the horns of a bull, that rode through the turn of the century on bicycles, and that is still giving it a mighty good ride 328 years later. Bicycling was such a big sport on Long Island that at one time the Long Island Railroad ran bicycle cars, and they were filled with two-wheeled travelers. And we will move from the two-wheeled to the four-legged when we return after these messages. Walk through the past, but let's move it to a trot. Horses, you see, were central to Long Island's sporting life. The broad open plains were perfect for training, and the deep local pockets, well, they were perfect for backers. One of the most dominant horses of its era was no doubt Lady Suffolk, and one of the most dominant horse families was no doubt the Burrs. Both produced hoofbeats heard round the world, and both produced them from Commack. This Commack Crossroads, Jericho Turnpike and Commack Road, is a busy one today, but its past has been even busier in this old town. But first, pronunciation. The town name comes from the Indian Winnecomick, meaning pleasant land. It was shortened to Commack last century, then mispronounced Commack, as in Commack Corners, that busy intersection. There, a key toll gate, literally a gate, was set up for islanders traveling by toll roads in the 1800s. They would pay according to the animal they rode, for the luxury of hard earth, or, if lucky, hard wood. Right near the intersection, and made of that same hard wood, is a Methodist church. It hasn't changed much since its founding in 1789, and as these original church board minutes testify, it's the oldest continuously used Methodist church in the state. Also near the intersection stood the house of Edward Lange, a man who supported his family in the 1800s by making art of Long Island towns. Those of the land, those by the water, even the intersection we've been speaking of. He also drew the Burr homestead near that crossroads, a home that looks the same now, including the horses. At the time, horse breeding and racing was the family fortune. Burr even sold horses to Napoleon, and he had a half-mile track right behind the house, and a second oval, a full mile, not far away. Ironically, a Burr member is buried where that track used to be, in a tiny cemetery surrounded by Modell's shopping center. Commack also produced the racehorse of the era, Lady Suffolk. She thrashed grain on this barn floor and pulled a butcher's wagon before being spied by a drinking man at this tavern and bought on this spot for $112.50. Slowly, or not so slowly, the horse stunned the racing world, passing competitors in 17 states and breaking the then sacrosanct 2.5-minute mile. By the time she retired, the Old Gray Mare, the song was written for her, had won 89 of 162 races and won a record $60,000. Now, Commack was the course last century, but another gained world fame this century, home of the last jewel of the Triple Crown, and home to thousands of Long Islanders. Ladies and gentlemen, we're off to Elmont. Yes, there are timely signs in Elmont, but there are also signs of the past, and they often speak about matters of life and death in this old town. For example, the neighborhood named after newspapers, live newspapers like the Times, but many more dead ones which fell in the past 70 years like so many setting suns. Then there is Francis Lewis, whose boulevard begins in Elmont. He was celebrated in his lifetime as a signer of the Declaration, but after death came accusations that during the Revolution and other wars he made his fortune by profiteering, that his hand was more in the soldier's pocket than his own. Speaking of death, there's Cemetery Row. It is perhaps the longest expanse of cemeteries on Long Island. When Manhattan ran out of space for the deceased, or decided it was worth more to the living, it first sent them to Brooklyn, then to Elmont. More specifically, to Beth David, Maimonides, St. Boniface, Presbyterian, and St. John's, and townsfolk chiseled out a living from related industries. Shifting to living, Elmont was the site of one of the liveliest and most important aviation events, the first International Aviation Tournament in 1910. It was supervised by the Wright brothers themselves, who worked with pilot Ralph Johnstone to fly their biplane to a record 9,716 feet. All the big names were there to usher in aviation, and 150,000 were there to usher in the aviators. But what really drew the crowds was the horse racing at Belmont Park, from that spring day in 1905 when August Belmont II opened his track. And wouldn't you know, in a featured race, the winner was number 8, Blandy, owned by one August Belmont. In those days of the first grandstand, the best seats were at the very top, the bleachers, and betting was done through a bunch of bookmakers, each with his own odds, which stayed constant no matter how fans were betting. The big white pine anchored the paddock back then, just as it does now, sometimes surrounded by white. On such days, the track seems more suited to Winter Olympics, and the new stands, built in 1968, stare coldly at the cold grave in the infield of Ruffian, who broke down during a match race. But the finish line still beckons, the line where Secretariat won by 31 lengths in a world record 2:24, and the line, like Elmont itself, where past and present seem to meet. So the results are in. Elmont is a town filled with activity, from racetrack to air show, and a town filled with rest, Cemetery Row. And finally, a look at an unexpected entry in our sports stakes. You might not associate Lindenhurst with recreation. Sure, it was home to a bunch of breweries which provide recreational activity of sorts, but you wouldn't expect Ruth and Gehrig to visit Lindenhurst, and certainly not to play there, and if so, not against the local Lindenhurst 9, but it's all part of Lindenhurst history.
What's in a name? Well, quite a bit in Lindenhurst. As you pass through its decades of history, you discover a lot of name-calling in this old town. For example, when the Indians first sold the town, they called it Forsaken Land. Then, when Northerners moved down for the salt hay, they called it South Huntington. But the biggest change was when Thomas Wellwood bought the land and arranged with Charles Schleier to lure Germans and German Americans there. They called the town Breslau, like the German city, and served beer to prospective buyers. Sales tours would get rowdy.
One of the men got knocked on the ground, and his 300-pound wife came and stomped on the marauders, and I think she shoved an umbrella into one of them.
Finally, the town was named Lindenhurst, Linden Grove, but it didn't turn over a new leaf. One of its major industries was its breweries, the only ones on Long Island. And with them, the pubs, 60 in 3 square miles, that made Ripley's Believe It or Not. For the brew, an ice house was set out by the frozen town lake, a lake that's still there, though much of it now park, and nearby a church where once stood a brewery. And the biggest beer, appropriately, was Linden, the pride of Long Island. And its factory was the pride of townsfolk, because it had a sink that tapped into the beer kegs. So anybody who ambled in would just turn on the faucet and the beer would flow like water?
Right.
Did you have lots of visitors?
Lots of visitors.
Just across the street, at a favorite fish restaurant and favorite fishing spot, came 2 very famous visitors. Lou Gehrig at center and Babe Ruth at right loved to fish the waters of Lindenhurst. They even set up perhaps the island's most amazing sporting event, a game between their big league all-stars and the local semi-pro team. That day, Gehrig took his cuts, as did the Babe. And on this spot, the Babe hit a ball on a line that dropped just beside Montauk Highway. Out of courtesy, he stopped at third base. Out of courtesy, too, he left an autographed ball.
And those local baseball clubs with some big names were all around the island. More on that after the break when we speak to Dr. Barbara Kelly, head of the Long Island Studies Institute at Hofstra University. She'll talk sports, this old town sports. Welcome back. We have been taking a run through Long Island sports history, and to help us get a second wind, we are joined by Dr. Barbara Kelly. She is the head of the Long Island Studies Institute at Hofstra University. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about the clubs that I mentioned in those pieces and the exclusivity of those clubs. I remember seeing a picture, I believe, of August Belmont fox hunting just off of Babylon in one of those clubs. Were they all that exclusive?
Yes, because they were privately owned. These men would join together and purchase a large piece of property, build a clubhouse, or if there were a house on site, they would take over that as the clubhouse, and it was their private preserve. What makes it very interesting is that in the 1960s, they began selling it off to the local communities, but leasing it back so they no longer had to pay taxes. It remained exclusive, but it was no longer theirs.
Now, that was for a while. Was there any point where democracy finally struck and where the people in general were allowed to take usage of that kind of parkland?
Yes, and a large amount of the credit for that belongs to Robert Moses, because at the end, well, even before the Depression, he began to push for the state acquisition of a large amount of property, which would foster recreation for the common person.
And I know that some of these, I'm thinking, I guess, and I believe we have some clips or some stills of the one outside Oakdale. Some of them are really quite beautiful to use even for the general public. The one in Oakdale, I think, was originally the South Side Sports Club.
Yes.
Had some wonderful trout fishing then, has some wonderful trout fishing now. Are there many like that really offer those kinds of accommodations, facilities?
No, not, I mean, you can go for trout fishing, but when the wealthy people came, they came out sort of to rough it, and they stayed in this clubhouse, which was very well staffed, and they roughed it in the country. And you no longer stay in the clubhouse, you simply go there and partake of the fishing.
Let's move from the clubs to the notion of racing, which we also touched upon. What happened to all of the great race breeding, race training among the horse racers here on Long Island? Not around anymore.
Well, property values, of course, had played a large part. You need a large site in order to do that. The problem, however, was bigger than that. Horse racing was building on Long Island up until the turn of the 20th century. At that point, the progressive reformers began to look askance at racing. They disdained the betting and the drinking that tended to go with it. And the New York State Legislature began to regulate. By 1908, the racetracks were beginning to close, and by 1912, even Belmont had to close down. It reopened in 1913 under the new rubrics. But that sort of dealt a bit of a death knell to the horse racing industry on Long Island, and then the buildup of suburbia made property worth much more for residential areas than it was for breeding of racehorses.
You know, one aspect that I didn't manage to get into, it's only 5 pieces there, I didn't manage to get into the notion of horse racing and the county fairs, because horse racing was really central to the county fairs, Mineola, Riverhead. Talk a little bit about that to fill us in.
It's interesting that you name those 2 towns as well, because those were the court towns. And horse racing originates even as far back as the colonial days, with the court days where people would come into town from their outflung farms and drink and race when the court closed down. And the fairs tended to be in these same county centers. At the beginning of the 19th century, the state of New York began to push for more scientific agriculture and animal husbandry, and so raising horses of a particular type for particular skills became part of the farmlands of Long Island.
You mentioned the betting, and if I'm remembering my history right, I think that originated at one of the county fairs. I think it was Mineola, when at least the legal betting, I'm sure the non-legal existed for a while,
yes.
The legal betting originated there and then sort of continued, obviously, until today.
Yeah. Well, but then it was, again, with the reformers, betting became totally illegal, and it's only with off-track betting in the more recent history that it has been legalized.
Let's shift one more time, and let's make that shift to baseball, to the diamond. We looked at some of those local baseball teams. How prevalent were those kind of teams? I remember, for example, seeing a Kings Park Psychiatric Hospital team that made the rounds and played other neighborhood teams on Long Island. Is that pretty typical?
Yes, and it's still typical. There are still some rather important semi-pro teams around the island, but Baseball was very important. Again, at the end of the 19th century, people became very interested in fitness, and sports was seen as a way not only for physical fitness, but for moral and social fitness. And baseball fits all of those qualifications. I mean, the best part about baseball is that where do you end up? At home. And that's always moral and good. So that baseball was the American pastime, in part because it lived up to our values as well as because it was fun to do. And every town sponsored some sort of small team.
And yet, ironically, we don't really have even a minor league team at this point on Long Island.
Yeah.
As recent headlines will tell us.
That's partly probably because of the availability of the major league teams. I mean, at one point we had 3 major league teams right in this general vicinity, and it probably made it unworthwhile. Now I think we'll probably move to a minor team soon.
You know, we seem to have slighted certain sports. We've talked about racing, we've talked about hunting, we've talked about baseball, but there are some that we haven't talked much about. Football, basketball, tennis, for example. They seem to be much less prominent, much less important in Long Island history. Is that the case, and if so, why?
I think partly because football, for most of its tenure, has been associated with collegiates. We have it, we just don't have it professionally. We have a large number of colleges on the island, and they all sponsor a team. Tennis, on the other hand, is somewhat elitist. One has to have the ability to provide a specialized court and specialized surroundings. So it's up until very recently, it's been the upper classes who could afford to support tennis. And there are a large number of private courses around the island.
I guess let's move, if we can, to the future. And, you know, just try to summarize for us how you see the future in terms of Long Island sports. Are we going to change the emphasis on certain sports from what it is now? What are we going to see come future in sports? Unfortunately,
I think we're going to continue to be highly organized in sports. We've been moving, I mean, if you think about even the little kids, they have pee-wee leagues that are organized. Kids no longer go out on the street and play stickball. They join a league and they go somewhere, and there's a coach and there are managers. And I think we're continuing to move into that highly specialized area and away from the casual, I will race you for $3 or...
Specialization even in sports.
Even
right?
in sports.
Thanks, Barbara, really. And we thank you very much generally for talking sports, though it's somewhat ancient sports. Our thanks also to viewers for listening to sports, though it's not quite the Ranger and Nick finals. Join us again for some more out-of-date but intriguing information when This Old Town Weekend Edition returns. For This Old Town Weekend Edition, I'm Allen Oren.